Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Early morning in Grant Park. The cold, piercing dawn of May 2040 sliced through Chicago's majestic skyscrapers, bathing the urban landscapes in a ghostly gray light. Even before the first sunbeams kissed the highest floors, a lone figure was already moving through the deserted Grant Park. This was Elijah L. Green, his 50-year-old back slightly hunched under the weight of a canvas bag, distended by something bulky and flat. His old but clean work overalls blended with the dim pre-dawn sky, making him almost invisible against the backdrop of the concrete jungle. The air was still fresh, not yet saturated with exhaust fumes and the smell of morning coffee, and each breath sent a slight chill through his lungs. L walked slowly, methodically, as if each step was part of a long, memorized ritual. His gaze, usually thoughtful and deep, was fixed on the horizon where, like a gigantic skeleton, a new, faceless residential complex loomed. Steel structures and concrete blocks stretched skyward, symbolizing relentless progress and indifference to the past. Reaching the construction fence, L paused. His fingers, calloused from years of work, slowly untied the drawstrings of his canvas bag. From it, he carefully extracted a small sketch that seemed to glow in the dim light. On it, with striking detail and vibrant colors, were depicted the old buildings of this very district. Not the soulless boxes being erected now, but homes with history, with soul, with unique architecture that breathed the past. He didn't just draw bricks and windows. He captured the character, the atmosphere, the shadows and light that created the unique personality of these dying streets. It was not just a drawing, but a cry from his soul, imprinted on paper. L was a muralist, his talent undeniable, but alas, unrecognized. In a world ruled by money and power, his art, imbued with the spirit of old Chicago, proved to be unwanted. He dreamed of his works adorning building facades, telling the city's stories, but for now his hands were occupied only with laying tiles, a routine, thankless job that barely allowed him to make ends meet. He looked at the sketch, then back at the towering concrete monolith. A shadow of regret flickered in his eyes, but it quickly gave way to a familiar, weary determination. He knew his place in this world, at least for now. He was not one to change the course of time or stop the relentless machine of progress, but he could at least preserve memories, capture what was, before it disappeared forever. Folding the sketch and carefully tucking it back into his bag, L slowly moved towards the openings of the unfinished skyscraper. There was no haste or despair in his steps, only silent acceptance of his fate. He disappeared into the maw of the construction site, becoming one of the many shadows moving in the pre-dawn gloom. His world, a world of art and soul, had to give way for a time to a world of concrete, steel, and hard physical labor. But he knew that the city's soul, like his own, continued to live, awaiting its hour to assert itself once more. The damp, acrid stench of wet concrete and caustic construction dust hung heavy in the air. It permeated the lungs, settled on clothes, and seeped into the skin. Inside the unfinished skyscraper, a dull roar prevailed. The screech of metal, the whine of saws, the clatter of falling tools. A man, dust-covered and almost indistinguishable among dozens of other workers, toiled with focused intensity, laying tiles. His movements were honed by years of practice. Each tile joint was impeccable. He worked with the precision worthy of a jeweler, creating not merely a floor covering, but a pattern that seemed to possess its own rhythm. Suddenly, through the construction chaos, loud, confident voices cut through, unaccustomed to the clamor of a building site. Two expensive suits, sharply contrasting with the dirty overalls and faded hard hats, approached. Their wearers, the White brothers, owners of the construction company, were the embodiment of arrogance and power. Their polished shoes glided across the concrete floor, ignoring the dust and debris. They surveyed the work with a condescending air, their faces displaying a mix of boredom and superiority. One of them, Braxton White, with a predatory, self-satisfied smile, sharply waved a hand, pointing at Elle. The words they spoke were muffled by the noise, but their tone and haughty gestures spoke more eloquently than any phrases. It seemed every glance, every movement of theirs was steeped in contempt. Elle felt it. He straightened up slowly, as if not wanting to draw unnecessary attention to himself. His gaze remained calm, but in its depths lay a profound, habitual weariness. A weariness not from physical labor, but from the constant sting of others' condescension, from the perpetual challenge to his dignity. Braxton White stepped closer, his shadow falling over Elle. He bent down and disdainfully tossed several crumpled bills onto the freshly laid tile. It wasn't an advance nor payment, it was an offering, a gesture meant to humiliate. "Here's yours, and don't let me see your face around here again." The words were uttered through gritted teeth, but Elle caught them. White pointed dismissively toward the exit, his finger trembling with suppressed anger. Elle did not reply. There was no point. He slowly, with dignity, stooped and picked up the money. His fingers lingered on the crumpled bills, as if weighing not their denomination, but the burden of the humiliation. Then he slowly, methodically gathered his tools. Each tool, the trowel, the level, the plumb bob, was for him an extension of his hands, a part of his essence. He did not rush. His movements were calm and deliberate, as if he deliberately prolonged the moment to make the Whites understand that their disdain would not break his spirit. When everything was packed, Elle cast a final glance around the unfinished floor. His gaze lingered on the tiles he had laid, on the impeccable seams that perhaps no one would ever notice. He raised his head, his eyes meeting Braxton White's arrogant stare. In that gaze there was no hatred, no anger, only profound sorrow and something that could be read as, "You don't understand what you're losing." With dignity, which was his shield, El Green left the site, dissolving into the dim openings of the construction, leaving behind only the smell of concrete and an unspoken protest. Silence. As one moved away from the neon-drenched central streets of Chicago, the urban landscape yielded to quiet, ivy-covered alleys of an old district, where the spirit of bygone eras still seeped through the gray brick walls. Above one such narrow doorway, almost hidden beneath crumbling plaster, an old faded sign dimly glowed, "May's Gallery." Its letters, once vibrant, were now barely discernible, as if the sign itself had grown weary of its battle against time. Inside, warmth mingled with the deliberate yet cozy chaos. The ceiling was high with time-worn, darkened beams. The walls, painted a deep blue, were densely hung with paintings of all sizes and styles, from abstract brushstrokes to hyper-realistic portraits. Sculptures, crafted from metal, wood, and even found artifacts were arranged without much order, creating the impression of an artistic labyrinth. The air was permeated with the scent of oil paints, old paper, and something subtly homely, as if the very paintings resided within this gallery. In a corner, bathed in the glow of a single directed lamp, sat an elderly woman. This was May, the gallery owner. Her thin fingers, speckled with age spots, methodically traced the edge of an old, almost finished canvas depicting a sunset over a city harbor. In her eyes, hidden behind thick lens spectacles, one could read a deep yet kind wisdom, accumulated over years of life among art and people. She was the guardian of this quiet oasis, understanding that art was not merely canvases and paints, but also the stories they told and the souls they reflected. The gallery door creaked open, breaking the tranquil silence. Elle appeared in the doorway. On his face there were no traces of recent humiliation, no imprint of anger, only a focused intensity, the familiar detachment of an artist already envisioning his next work. His eyes instantly found May. There was no need for words between them. Their connection ran deeper, built on a shared understanding of art and a common perspective on the world. Elle silently retrieved a large, rolled canvas from his canvas bag. He carefully unfurled it, and in the dim light of the gallery, an image shimmered. It was not merely a city landscape. It was the old city brought to life, its spirit, its colors, its wrinkles, its inexpressible aura, which the whites had so diligently tried to erase from the face of the earth. The canvas captured winding streets, ancient facades, the faces of local residents, their smiles and shadows. It was a monumental canvas, pulsating with life, a stark contrast to the soulless concrete Elle had been laying that very morning. May slowly turned. Her eyes, usually reserved, lit up. She rose, approached closer, her gaze sweeping over every detail, every brushstroke. A silent exchange passed between them. In her eyes, admiration and understanding were visible. She nodded, then pointed to an empty space on the wall, cleared of other paintings, as if it had been waiting specifically for this canvas. Elle responded with a brief nod. Without superfluous words, without empty phrases, they understood each other implicitly. This was not a dialogue, but a profound co-creation, an exchange of energy. At the same time, outside, under a drizzling rain, a young journalist named Amber stood with a camera in her hands. Her lens was directed at the old, dilapidated buildings, living out their final days before demolition. Her face expressed deep bewilderment. She filmed every crack, every chip on the facades, trying to understand why this city so mercilessly shed its past. She sought a story that could explain this cruelty, and for now she found only the empty promises of developers and the indifference of officials. She sensed that something more profound than just decaying structures lay behind these walls, and her intuition led her precisely here. A ghostly, dim light from the Chicago night seeped through the single grimy window of a cramped, cheerless room. This was Elle's dwelling, the place where he spent his nights when he wasn't working or wandering the city. The room was Spartan, yet not empty. Sketches, drafts, and drafts of other drafts hung on the walls, as if every free surface were a canvas. The air here was heavy, permeated with the scent of turpentine, dried paint, and old paper. Elle sat by the window in an old sagging armchair. On his lap lay his sketchbook, his faithful companion. The thin graphite of his pencil glided across the paper, creating images born in his mind, inspired by what he saw and felt. Page after page filled with his world. Here were the faces of laborers, their tired but proud gazes captured in a few strokes. There, cracks on the walls of old buildings, each telling its own story. Silhouettes of houses, slowly dissolving into the city's shadows like ghosts of a bygone era. He wasn't simply copying, he was breathing life into each image, capturing the invisible connection that existed between him and this city. He felt the city whispering its stories, its secrets, its pains to him, and he, Elle, was the one who gave them a voice. At that very moment, across town, in the noisy and somewhat chaotic newsroom of a local newspaper, the young journalist Amber sat at her desk, surrounded by mountains of papers and coffee cups. Her gaze was fixed on her computer screen, where frames she had shot in recent days flickered by. The demolition of old buildings, their slow, agonizing destruction under the excavator's claw, the faces of local residents, filled with anger and despair, their silent protest, and against this backdrop, the faceless, empty promises of developers, words that held no weight or meaning. Amber was searching for something. She felt that something more profound than just an ordinary construction project lay hidden behind these events. Something unjust, something dirty. Her journalistic instinct, sharpened by years of covering local stories, screamed that there was a hidden context here that needed to be uncovered. She reviewed dozens of videos, hundreds of photos, trying to find that hook, that detail that would reveal the whole truth. And then her gaze coincidentally fell upon a small announcement on one of the local news websites. May's Gallery, exhibition, Soul of the Old City. Something about that title made her pause. Soul of the Old City. That was exactly what she felt but couldn't articulate. There was something in it that resonated with her own feelings. The thumbnail image showed a part of a painting, and in it, she sensed the same pain and the same love for the vanishing Chicago as in her own reports. Amber felt a spark ignite within her. This wasn't just an art announcement. It was an invitation into a world that, perhaps, held the answers to her questions. She knew she had to go there. Her camera, usually dormant in her bag, suddenly felt heavier, filled with unspoken stories. The courtroom was filled with a taut, suffocating silence. Only the faint hiss of microphones and the occasional rustle of papers could be heard. On the faces of the White brothers, usually so arrogant and self-assured, now settled a pained, almost animalistic expression. They were pale, their eyes darting around the room, trying to avoid the impartial gaze of the judge and the condemning stares of those present. Their impeccable suits, it seemed, had lost their polish, and their aura of power had dissolved into the very air. On the massive screen, positioned behind the judge, one of L's paintings, Soul of the Old City, was displayed in a close-up. Then the image shifted. Now the screen flickered with footage from police body cameras, recordings from hidden microphones, fragments of phone conversations where the voices of the White brothers, distinct and merciless, discussed their illicit dealings. These were followed by testimonies from people whose homes had been demolished, their voices trembling with pain and resentment. Each new frame, each new word was a blow that echoed through the courtroom, systematically dismantling their reputation and their empire. Quiet. L sat on the witness stand, his gaze locked on the screen. His face was calm. There was no triumph in it, no malice. Only a deep, almost meditative detachment. He was merely a witness to justice, which was slowly but inexorably being served. He watched the faces of the White brothers, saw their panic, their fear, and in this, there was no satisfaction for him. Only the profound realization that the truth had, at last, prevailed. Days passed, then weeks. Outside, beyond the window of his small apartment, an autumn rain poured, washing the dust from the streets of Chicago, as if cleansing the city of grime and deceit. L returned to his old apartment, to his humble yet profoundly meaningful world. On the wall above his workbench now hung a small but vibrant sketch, the very one he had taken from his bag early that morning in Grant Park. It was a tangible reminder of where it all began, of the single spark that ignited a chain reaction. Several months later, in the square where old houses once stood, then only an excavated pit, a new building now rose. A skyscraper, yes, but not a faceless one, not like those the White brothers built. On one of its massive walls, soaring skyward, an enormous, vibrant, monumental mural appeared. It was L's work. It depicted not merely the old city, but its history, its people, its spirit, as if plucked from oblivion and brought vividly back to life before everyone's eyes. The colors were deep, the lines powerful, the images undeniably alive. It was a testament that art could be not only beauty, but also a voice and a memory. At the base of the mural stood a small but prominent plaque. On it, engraved in bold letters, was his name, Elijah Green. A crowd of people stood below, their faces lifted to the sky, illuminated by the rays of the rising sun. They gazed at the mural, and in their eyes there was not only admiration, but also understanding. An understanding that the city had finally remembered its soul. And L, the muralist who once laid tiles, had become the voice of the city, its memory, its conscience. He stood somewhere in the crowd watching, and in that moment he knew that his art had at last found its true place. The meticulously aimed spotlights directed onto each canvas bathed the spacious halls of May's gallery, not merely in light, but in a soft, almost tangible glow, creating a truly magical, even sacred atmosphere. The air here was thick with the aroma of aged wine, mingling with the faint scent of paints and the quiet, soothing murmur of voices, blending into a single, gentle musical backdrop. The hall was packed. Everyone was present. Renowned art critics with haughty, intelligent faces, their gazes gliding over the canvases, assessing not only the mastery, but also the potential value. Collectors, exchanging hushed whispers about the rarity and uniqueness of the presented works, and, most valuable to May and Elle, local residents, people who had lived in this neighborhood their entire lives, and whose eyes shone with deep recognition at the sight of familiar streets and faces. Whispers transitioned into soft laughter. The clinking of glasses echoed. All of this created a lively, vibrating, almost palpable background for the main event that was about to unfold. At the very heart of this vibrant scene, of course, were Elle's works, monumental in their size and emotional depth. They didn't merely hang on the walls. They pulsed with life, like living organisms. Each canvas was a silent storyteller, narrating the difficult yet proud history of the city, of its people, of its walls that had witnessed so much. Spectators paused before them, as if held by an invisible force. Some stood with tears in their eyes, profoundly moved, others with a thoughtful, almost sorrowful smile. Each painting was not just an image, but an entire chapter, snatched from oblivion, of Chicago's history, seen through the eyes of a man who felt it to his very core. Elle stood to the side, almost imperceptible, blending into the deep shadow of a tall partition, observing the reactions. In his gaze there was no hint of pride, no trace of smugness. Only the deep, quiet contentment of an artist whose works had finally found resonance, breaking through the noise and indifference. He was like an invisible conductor whose art made hearts beat in unison with his own, revealing souls. Suddenly, the gallery door swung open with a light but distinct creak that instantly shattered the harmonious tranquility. The White brothers appeared on the threshold, their faces arrogant, as if carved from stone, and their expensive suits impeccable to the last stitch. They entered like two predators invading a flock of sheep, and the crowd, which had been buzzing and lively, instantly fell silent, parting before them like the sea before a ship. The developers surveyed the gallery, their glances sliding over the paintings with obvious disdain, with an expression of disgust on their faces until they landed on Elle's works. At that moment, the brothers' faces contorted, first with anger, then with recognition. This was the very worker they had humiliated just days before, a man they considered insignificant, now inexplicably at the center of attention. They moved forward, their steps heavy and confident, their gazes threatening, filled with unspoken indignation. It seemed they were about to create a grand scandal, to retract their words, to publicly assert their superiority and put an end to this inappropriate exhibition. But the young journalist Amber, as if appearing from nowhere, beat them to it. She emerged so quickly that her movements seemed almost spectral. Her eyes burned with resolve, and an invisible strength was palpable in every step. A microphone was in her hand. Her small yet powerful camera hung around her neck, ready to capture every moment. She moved directly towards Elle, ignoring the threatening, furious glares of the White brothers. Amber raised her microphone without uttering a word. Her silence was louder than any shout. The spotlights, previously soft and diffuse, suddenly flared sharply and blindingly. On the gallery walls, directly superimposed over Elle's paintings, enormous pulsating projections began to appear. These were the frames Amber had shot, not just still photos, but live testimonies. The demolition of old buildings, their slow, agonizing destruction under the blows of excavators. Then the dirty schemes of the developers, their signatures on questionable documents, confirming their corrupt dealings, the faces of people who had lost their homes, their tears, their despair, their silent pleas. Each image, each frame was a blow, precise, merciless, that echoed through the hall, systematically, brick by brick, dismantling their once impeccable reputation and their carefully constructed empire. The voices of the developers, captured by a hidden camera, spoke words of contempt and utter indifference to people's fates. This was not merely a report, it was an accusation, projected onto the very heart of their hypocrisy, onto their true selves. On the faces of the White brothers, shock was reflected first, then rage, giving way to pure, animalistic panic. Their arrogant masks fell, revealing their true nature. The truth, bright and merciless, filled the gallery walls, illuminating their depravity and exposing them to the entire world.